Now, when Obama was elected President of the United States of America, my father tried to convince me somehow that Obama would be good for Africa because he was the son of an African migrant, or because he was well-read in African history. But comrades, listen to what Obama really had to say to the Ghanaian parliament in 2009 on this short video clip. Oops.
The West has often approached Africa as a patron or a source of resources rather than a partner. The West is not responsible for the destruction of the Zimbabwean economy over the last decade, or wars in which children are enlisted as combatants. In my father's life, it was partly tribalism, patronage, and nepotism in an independent Kenya that for a long stretch derailed his career. And we know that this kind of corruption is still a daily fact of life for far too many.
Now you can see this quote by Barack Obama summarizes basically the approach of the ruling class towards Africa today. It's basically blame Africans for the failures of the continent. And what Obama later on goes to say in his speech, and implicitly says it, is that you need some kind of Western intervention on the continent to bring peace, stability, and democracy. But before I jump on to Obama, let's look at the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the countries that Obama would refer to today as plagued by wars, where children are enlisted as combatants. And let's look at the history since independence. Now, in 1960, a man that you see here called Patrice Lumumba became the first prime minister of independent Congo. And the Congo, you have to know this, was the bloodiest colony in the history of Africa. Now, the Belgians said that they had colonized Congo to promote free trade, but instead, they gave a monopoly to their companies over the extraction of natural resources. And the Belgians said that they colonized the Congo to stop slavery, but instead they enforced forced labor to serve their companies. Every European power in Africa used forced labor to exploit people for their companies. But in the Congo, the conditions of work were so hard that in the first 20 years of colonization, the Congo lost more than 60% of its population. So what happened in the Congo, basically, during colonization was nothing short of a genocide. And finally, the Belgians said that they were colonizing Africa to bring civilization. But after 80 years of colonial rule, only 1%, less than 1% of the Congolese population had access to some form of education. And so on Independence Day, Lumumba made a speech where he told the King of Belgium to his face that independence wasn't given to the Congolese out of Belgian generosity, but the independence was won through the struggles of his Congolese brothers and sisters. And Lumumba said this at a time when there was hope on the African continent, because different African countries were gaining their independence, and leaders like Nkrumah of Ghana, Nyerere and Tanzania were all speaking out against imperialism. But what is imperialism? And let's talk about imperialism, because we Marxists understand imperialism as a stage in capitalism that begins in the late 19th century. And we define imperialism as the merger between the owners of big businesses and the people who run the states. And this means that economic competition between big businesses, basically, takes the form of competition between big capitalist states across the globe for control of different trade routes, natural resources, and basically control of different parts of the world. And so, but most importantly, we argue that the competition between big capitalist powers leads to war. And if you look at it in the 19th century, there was the colonization of Africa, and there was different imperialist conflicts over different parts of Europe and across the world. And this led to World War I, and it also led to World War II. And the problem with African independence in the 1960s is that it arrives in the middle of the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union are fighting for influence across the world. And in a way, Lumumba becomes the first African leader to be the victim of the Cold War. Now, Lumumba, who you see here, was no revolutionary socialist. Lumumba was a nationalist. He wanted a unified Congo. But he finds himself becoming increasingly radicalized in the first year he's prime minister, because the Belgium are still trying to remain in control of the natural resources in the Congo. And what the Belgians do, basically, is they try to encourage the separation of the richest part of the Congo, the secession of that part, where all the mineral wealth is. And so Lumumba, who is increasingly radicalized, he holds rallies where he speaks out against the Belgium. But also one thing that he does is that he asks the Soviet Union for military assistance. And when you do that, when you ask the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War, you draw the attention of the Americans and the CIA. And so the CIA and the Belgians worked together to kill Lumumba, and they eventually managed to kill him after he was prime minister for just about 1 year. And so that's the tragedy of African independence, is that it happens in the middle of the Cold War. And instead of Lumumba, who came to power? The CIA helped a man called Mobutu come to power. Mobutu was a bloody dictator who killed all opposition, and who stayed in power for 27 years because he served the interests of the West. And in the 1990s, when the West was fed up of Mobutu, what they did is that they provided military assistance to Uganda and Rwanda so that Uganda and Rwanda could create guerrilla armies in the Congo that would overthrow Mobutu. And that's the background to two bloody wars that occurred in the 1990s, where you have like millions of deaths, and there's still war in the Congo going on today, where you have, of course, what Obama calls the children who are enlisted as soldiers. And so when a lion bigger, like Barack Obama, says that the West is here to bring peace and stability and democracy, we know that through the example of the Congo, that the West has brought nothing but havoc and misery. And now, I want to talk about how Africa became the hopeless continent at some point in time. Because when I was growing up, I went to a Pan-African school, which was run by Congolese people. And the Congolese people were obsessed with one question. It was, if Lumumba had not been assassinated, would he have been able, basically, to bring about the economic independence of the Congo that he hoped for? And my answer to that question is no. Because you have to look at what every single African country was trying to do at the end of independence. Right? After independence, all African countries were underdeveloped, and what they wanted to build was an industry. They wanted to be like the West or like the Soviet Union, because those were the rich countries at the time that Africans wanted to aspire to. And so how did they try to do that? In the 1960s and the 1970s, African nations used a state-led model of development, where the states basically borrowed from European banks and European countries, and then invested in the African economy. And they invested in health and education, but also different developmental projects, building roads and dams and bridges to build an industry and to hire people. And they could repay those debts because they could export their natural resources. And this is also the time when you get a wave of nationalizations, not only just in Africa, but over the third world, where the state takes over the foreign companies and manages their own business. That's nationalization. And even Mobutu, who was supposed to be the lackey of the West, nationalized the biggest mining company that used to belong to the Belgians in the Congo. But this state-led model of development comes into a crisis in the 1970s. Why? Because there's a global recession, basically. And the West and Europe and America cannot afford to buy more commodities, more natural resources from Africa. And so basically that means that African countries aren't selling their natural resources, and they're not making enough money, and so they can't repay their debts. And when they can't repay their debts, basically, all the African countries are bankrupt. And this is when two institutions step in, and these institutions play still an essential role on the African continent today. They're the IMF and the World Bank. And the IMF and the World Bank are not neutral institutions. They were institutions of American capitalism to stamp out Soviet competition. And in Africa, what they do, they basically sabotage any attempts of African countries to become independents and increase the dependency of Africa towards the left, towards the West. Now, how do the IMF do that? What they do is that they impose austerity on African countries. They come up to African leaders, they say, you are bankrupt, we will give you loans. But we will give you loans on the condition that you cut back on your government spending, that you cut back on your financing of the schools or on the healthcare systems, or that you abandon your nationalization and sell it to foreign companies for privatization, and that you open the market for European cheaper goods coming from Europe or the Americas. And that's what African countries did, and they find themselves increasingly dependent on the West. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, austerity had a terrible effect on the African people. There was mass unemployment because of the downsizing of government and also the closure of national factories. And this is when you get the growth of corruption because nobody's getting paid well. This is when there's military coups because the army is not paid well. And when you get military coups, this generally leads to war. And if you look at Mobutu, what happens to Mobutu's regime in the 1990s, all the Western companies actually pull out one by one. And at the same time, Mobutu is facing resistance from students who can't get a proper education. But also, he's facing divisions within his army who is not paid well. And at the same time, he has another guerrilla army who's traveling across the Congo to overthrow him. And they do manage to overthrow him. And this is when you get the cover of The Economist magazine that says Africa is a hopeless continent. It's a continent plagued by instability, by civil wars, where children are enlisted as soldiers, as Obama always talked about. And so, maybe we can ask ourselves, maybe Lumumba died at the right time, in the sense that he died at a moment where he could still be known as a hero, and he didn't sell out the Congo down to the IMF or the World Bank. I mean, it's a question that I have. But anyways, let's move on to the next century, because the next century, the early 2000s, is funny. Because if you look at the ruling class magazines, like the Financial Times or The Economist, the narrative on Africa suddenly starts to change. There's no more talk about Africa being the hopeless continent. Africa now is the country that is rising. And what do the economists and the Financial Times point to? They point to two things. The higher levels of foreign direct investment, that means investment by private companies or individuals, which have multiplied since the 1990s by 20 times or 19 times. And they also point out to the growth of skyscrapers in cities like Lagos or Nairobi. And so, why does the perspective of Africa change in the eyes of the ruling class in the West? And the explanation behind it is because of the rise of China and other emerging countries like Brazil and India. These countries nowadays are major industrial powers, and they're looking for the energy resources from Africa to get their industry going or to feed their growing population. And so this causes more investment from especially China on the African continent and more trade. I mean, today China is the biggest trading partner in Africa. And so from the perspective of the ruling class in the West, it's a bit like, yo, the Chinese are catching us up. Maybe we should get the piece of that Africa. And the other explanation from the eyes of the ruling class in the West is, if you look at like the Middle East nowadays, where there's ISIS and drones that are dropping bombs on people, or communist Venezuela, maybe countries like Nigeria and Kenya aren't so bad after all, and maybe we should invest in them before the Chinese get there before us. And so this sets the stage for a competition that takes place between the US and China. But like I said, there are other players in the game. Like the old colonizers are still there, like France, the UK, and also the European Union is there, but also Russia, Brazil, and India to a lesser extent. And some call this new competition the new scramble for Africa. Now, what is the new scramble for Africa about? It's a scramble over African energy resources, especially oil and mining minerals. But it's a scramble that takes place at a time when the West controls less and less natural resources in the world. And the example is that if you look back in the 1960s, you had this big oil cartel called the Seven Sisters, which was filled of Western companies. You had like Shell, Exxon, Chevron, and BP. And in the 1950s, this oil company controlled 85% of the world's oil reserves and the world's oil production. But after time, what you have is a wave of nationalizations in the in the third world. And today, the Seven Sisters only control 3% of the world's oil reserves. And the Financial Times talks also about the new Seven Sisters. That means the national oil companies from China, Iran, Venezuela. And they, if you put a few of them together, they control 30% of the world's oil reserves and 30% of the world's oil production. And so 10% of the oil reserves are in Africa, and the US is increasingly looking to get oil imports from Africa. Why? Why is oil so important? Because oil is, in a way, the raw materials of raw materials. It is used everywhere in industry, but it's also a raw material that you can use to produce other raw materials. For instance, think about fertilizers. You can use fertilizers to make cash crops in Africa, and oil is extremely important. Now, who does this new scramble for Africa actually benefit? And it benefits a lot of the multinational corporations who are starting to become more and more increasing in Africa. But it certainly does not benefit the people. And you might want to take a look at that. This is what the new scramble of Africa means for most people. These are oil spills from Shell in Nigeria. It means that the people who live around the Delta area in Nigeria, like the Ogoni people, can no longer fish. They die from cancer. The life expectancy over there is extremely low. And the thing is that Shell and other oil companies or mining companies don't hire that many people because you don't need that many people to pull oil out of the earth. It's not a labor-intensive industry. And if you look at Nigeria in the past 10 years, the level of unemployment has actually gone up by 5%. Now, another group of people, set of people, who it also benefits, who the new scramble also benefits, is the African leaders. And I'll give you an example. Like in 2004, France had a problem with Ivory Coast's president. And they wanted to kick out Ivory Coast's president because they didn't approve him. And so what the Ivory Coast president could do is that he sold concessions to build a bridge and to build infrastructure in a port towards the Chinese or the Americans. He didn't actually sell it, he threatened to sell it. And so what it does is it actually the new competition gives an African president leverage, because he's not just dependent on France, but dependent on different imperialist powers. And so the story unfolded when a French multinational company actually decided to not listen to its government's sanction on the Ivory Coast and stepped in and said, hey, we'll make you a better offer and we'll give you more money. And in the end of the day, they got the concession to build the bridge. And I told you another thing, that imperialism is the merger between the owners of big businesses and the people who run the states. But this merger, or this marriage if you want, isn't always a happy marriage, and it's not always a loyal marriage. And in the case of Burkina Faso, you have a business, basically, that disobeyed the government of France to deal with the president of the Ivory Coast, which created a whole loads of problems between Chirac's government at the time and that business who still dealt with Ivory Coast. And so you see that multinationals basically seek alliance with different states, and this alliance kind of gives leverages to African heads of states. But let's speak about the Chinese. Now the Chinese are not there yet. They're, for instance, like the fourth biggest investor in Africa behind France, Britain, and the US. But the thing is that they're growing the fastest at the moment. And if you look at the business strategy of the Chinese in Africa, is that it's very straightforward. There's no talk about giving lessons of democracy to African presidents, telling them how to run a country, or giving in a talk about NGOs and good governance. There's none of that from the Chinese. The Chinese come in and tell the African leaders, we want your oil, we want your mineral resources, and in exchange, we'll build you anything that you want. And one of the examples of that is the Sudan. And the Chinese are actually very, audacious, because they go places where American and European companies can't go. And so, for instance, when there was international sanctions on Sudan in the early 2000s, Chevron, an American company, had to pull out of the Sudan. But that's when the Chinese came through and they built roads and a dam for Omar Bashir in exchange of the oil. And what the Chinese did over there is something quite exceptional, is that they shipped 20,000 slave workers, ex-prisoners from China, basically to build an oil pipeline that would link the rich oil fields in the south to the north. And so nowadays, the Chinese are the ones who benefit the most from the extraction of oil on the continent, from the Sudan, just the Sudan, not from the continent. Now, how do the Americans respond to that? Because the American government under Obama and to some extent under Trump, their response to the Chinese incursion into Africa has been one of total panic. And when America panics, they turn towards the Pentagon. And there has been an increase in military efforts from America on the African continent. For instance, in 2007, you have the creation of AFRICOM, the American Command in Africa. And how does America justify its military presence on the continent? Well, it says basically, we're coming here to fight terrorism and radical Islam. The war on terror gives a perfect example, gives a perfect excuse for the Americans to intervene on the continent. And the most horrible example of this in the past decade is basically NATO's bombing of Libya during the revolution. The Americans and the US basically use planes to bomb Libya, and then they use their proxy armies on the ground to go and secure the oil resources. And they did that cynically. It's not because they want to ship oil back to America or back to Europe or anything like that. They did it in many ways to cut off the Chinese who had oil contracts in Libya. And because the Chinese economy is growing increasingly dependent on oil. That's why they intervene on the continent. And so you see how imperialism works. Imperialism today in Africa increasingly rhymes with the shift from an economic competition to a military competition among capitalist powers. And this is alarming for us socialists. And this is why we need to build a resistance to imperialism in Africa, but also in every single part of the globe. Now, I want to spend the last part that I have talking about resistance to imperialism on the African continent. Because, in terms of class struggle, the UK is a very boring country. I mean, there's a very low amount of strikes. The last time there was a general strike in the UK was in 1926. If you look at Nigeria, for instance, in the past decade, there has been 10 general strikes. Or South Africa. South Africa is a country in the world that had the most general strikes in 2014. Was not general strikes, that had the most strike action in 2014. But I want to talk about a small country. A small country in West Africa that had a revolution in 2014 and 2015. And this country is Burkina Faso. Now, for 27 years, Burkina Faso was ruled by a dictator called Blaise Compaoré. And if you like, Blaise Compaoré is a bit like the Judas in African history, in the sense that he killed his best friend, Thomas Sankara. Now, Thomas Sankara was the last generation of enlightened leaders in the African continent in the 1980s. And he was a man who you probably know, who seriously tried to challenge French imperialism. And when he got into power, basically, he kicked out the French foreign companies. And he said from now on, the Burkinabe people will eat and wear stuff that is produced in Burkina Faso. And he also told his ministers, from now on, you guys will no longer have any privileges, but you are going to live a modest life. You know, you're going to have the same wage as any other working man. And the French hated that. And the other people who hated that was a section of the army led by Blaise Compaoré, who didn't want to give up their privileges. And in the end, they ended up killing Thomas Sankara. But 27 years later, the memory of Thomas Sankara still remains in the hearts and minds of the young people in Burkina Faso. And it remains in the hearts and minds of two people, a rapper called Smokey and a reggae artist called Sam K. And these two young people set up a movement called the Sweepers Citizens, or the Citizens Broom, that was basically that had basically planned to clean up basically the corruption within Burkina Faso. And so when Blaise Compaoré decided to go against his constitution and run for a fifth time in 2014, the Civics Broom basically called protests from August to October 2014. And so you had like thousands of young people, young working class people, but also young unemployed people who flooded the streets of Burkina Faso, and especially the capital, Ouagadougou. And as the autumn went on, the protests got more radical, and there was talk about saying to Blaise Compaoré, leave office, and at some point they even stormed the parliament. And under all this pressure, Blaise Compaoré was forced to resign. But what happened is that an elite section of the army basically forced him to resign and tried to take power. Because when the army steps in, basically, you had what you have in every single revolution in the world, was a situation of dual power, if you want, where you had the army who was trying to control the government and enforce power from above, and they had the benediction of the West and the African Union. But on the other hand, you had protesters on the streets who controlled the streets. And so what did the army try to do? The army basically tried to suspend the constitution, and send its troops down to the streets to pacify the protesters. And this is when the trade unions were quick to react. The trade unions called a general strike, which paralyzed the whole country for 2 weeks, and they encouraged the young people again to go out on the street. And Smokey from the Citizens Broom, he told Al Jazeera one time that if the army try and take power, well, we know where our strengths are. We're going to call the people out in the streets. And so the young unemployed and working class people flooded the streets, and the army basically was forced to retreat. They had to set up a transitional government and put a diplomat at the head of it, and they had to reinstate the constitutions and plan free elections for September 2015. And so that was an immense victory. And there's several lessons that we can learn from the experience in Burkina Faso. First of all, is that the working class played a crucial role within the protests. And the working class also was the was one of the forces that directly fought a constant battle against imperialism. And you have to look at the mining sector for that. The mining sector in Burkina Faso is one of the sectors which receives a high level of foreign direct investment, where multinational companies are flooding in. And during the 2014 and 15 revolution, workers in the mining sector, for instance, took over a gold mine industry and shut out their bosses. And the revolts were so bad that mining company had to shut down production for 3 or 4 months. That was the power of the working class, and that was their resistance against imperialism. But if we talk about another lesson on the wider movement, is the question of leadership. And a lot of the leadership of the revolution fell into the hands of grassroots movements from civil society, like the Citizens Broom, or trade unions. And these organizations are not organized to take power, and they didn't even ambition to take power. And so when they got their free elections, basically, they took a step back, and the political scene came to an opposition party with a leader who had ties with the old government and who had no interest whatsoever of going against neoliberalism, austerity on the continent, and whatsoever. But the positive thing from this experience is that the people of Burkina Faso realize that they have the power to stand up to their politicians. And I hope that in the future, they will be able to create a mass organization of the working class and young people that will not just fight for free election, but that will also seek to reorganize the whole of society from below. And I also think, that this mass organization will not be just about countering power, but it would be about, ending the privileges or the rule of the multinational corporations and their corrupt African leaders once and for all. That's all.
It was such an interesting, debate, I should say. Well, to begin with, just some important elements you pointed out in talking about imperialism in Africa today. I would like us, in a kind way, to dispel the idea of what I call plain white theory. It doesn't hold water anymore. What does independence mean to us? Talking about imperialism and the whole, African revolutionaries you mentioned, from Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was not just killed by the Belgian authorities. His own brother, just like Compaoré did in Burkina Faso, Mobutu Sese Seko, late Moise Tshombe, who hijacked the Katanga province, because that's the richest part of DR Congo today, connived with late Mobutu Sese Seko, and they brought him down, not just because the Belgium wanted to destroy him. No. Okay, talking about the idea of Chinese everywhere in Africa today. Take for instance the case of Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe kicked out the white farmers and returned the land back to the black Zimbabweans. What happened after that? They couldn't even manage the land. Now that they kicked him out, they are inviting the same white people back again to take over the land. Do we blame them? When you train your own dog on how to eat raw meat, do not turn around to accuse other dogs when the real human beings are eating. That is the point. So talking about imperialism and looking back and forth saying, oh, the white is, no, it doesn't help us anymore. It doesn't, to be honest with you. I respect Walter Rodney for giving us one of the best literatures, in history. But if you look at the fate of that young man, when he was here in SOAS, in 1965 to be precise, he was speaking to a class of Guyanese. Let's return back to Guyana. Guyana will need us more than any country in the developed world will need us. He went back home, and what happened to him? He got killed by his own brother, late F.S. Bonham. All right? So if you look at the conspiracy theory within Africa, that is what we should be focusing on and debating and making sure we hold our leaders responsible, and not to turn around and look at the outsiders. Blame the white theory doesn't hold water to me as far as I'm concerned, because I'm a deep-rooted student of African history. Thank you.
I just have a short question. I come from Germany, and it was a long article on Kenya and also neighboring countries about a new system of payment. We're using your phone, basically, so not actually having to carry money, which is a great security issue, because if you do have money in your pocket, you're likely to be attacked round the next street corner. And millions of people actually using it. And there was one sentence in the article that sort of made me fall off my chair. I could hardly believe it. The World Bank actually tried to prevent this project, and it was apparently a more modernized communications minister who actually did the project. And now they've got, instead of having satellite phones, which are extremely expensive, nobody can afford them, they now have sort of line phones, and you can use the internet in many, many places. And so could you perhaps say something a bit more about how the World Bank in that particular, I don't know if you know that, or perhaps somebody in the room, intervened to actually stop this project, which really, is for the benefit of ordinary people.
You spoke about the rise of corruption in the 1980s?
Can't hear you.
You spoke about the rise of corruption in the 1980s, and you said it was because they weren't being paid enough, but was it necessarily because they weren't being paid enough, or because they wanted to live beyond their means, send their kids to schools abroad, that kind of thing?
She's speaking about the rise of corruption in the 1980s.
I just asked if the rise of corruption was because they weren't being paid enough, or because they were living beyond their means, sending their kids to schools abroad, that kind of thing.
In the front.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to support what you were saying, really. I mean, like, for the last 10 years, like, I've been trying to, as you were saying, build the resistance, I mean, mainly in Nigeria. And there, I mean, it seems to me our main argument is between, like, the tradition of the SWP, of socialism from below, and the sort of Stalinist tradition of almost a stagist position of what we have to do first is build the economy. So, we have huge concerns, how do we build an authentic, independent, non-dependent Nigerian economy? What do we need to do to have a successful car industry in Nigeria, things like that? And I mean, part of it is like the trickle down. I mean, it was the same sort of thing as Thatcher. We build the economy and the wealth will trickle down. And of course, we know from that experience in Britain, it doesn't trickle down. It gushes up. And, no, it really does. It's not funny. It gushes up massively. I mean, there has been a massive growth of the Nigerian economy over the last couple of decades. The rich in Nigeria are rich beyond their wildest dreams. They're richer than anybody in Britain. The richest person in Nigeria, Dangote, is richer than anybody in Britain. And there are layers of people below him who are fantastically rich as well. So last year in May, there was a wedding of the youngest daughter of a former military dictator. There were 26 executive jets turned up for that wedding.
Okay, a minute left, yeah.
Okay, so that, I mean, for us in Nigeria, the argument is not against imperialism, it's against the enemy at home. So, I mean, you showed the picture of Shell in the Niger Delta. At the beginning of last week, I was in the Niger Delta. The problem in the Niger Delta is not particularly Shell, it's the local government, it's the local ruling class. So we've got the governor of Bayelsa State sacking tens of thousands of people. He is the enemy.
Yes.
He is the direct enemy. I mean, obviously, Shell is in the background, but it's the rich Nigerian elite that are the problem, not imperialism, certainly directly.
In the floral Hawaiian shirt, yes.
Okay. I think one of there's an issue with dividing things up into saying that there's whether the enemy is the local people, the local ruling class, or imperialism. Because it seems to me that what we're talking about here is a system, and I think that's what Jim was trying to say. There's a system. The world system is imperialist, and that builds competition between countries. As it's, as one of the points is that imperialism is largely about competition between different countries, often the bourgeois countries, like the countries of the West, which happens to lead to exploitation of things in poorer countries. One of the practical things is that you see different countries in different places pushing their own rulers, so Nigeria's ruling class and South Africa's ruling class are sort of sub-imperialisms within Africa. What this means, how it relates to the other thing is that I think there's a danger in saying our enemy is at home, so we have to look at the rich and the people who are making money locally as our main enemy, because you can end up almost in Obama's position, which is to say, you've got to sort out these things. It's not to do with what's going on outside. And I think, actually, I have to say, it's to do with both. And that's the thing that's really a key issue in this thing. Because what you're seeing in the country I know most about is Kenya. If you're in Kenya, one of the things that's been remarkable over the past 20 or 30 years is to see the rise of sections of the middle classes and the upper classes. If you go there now, there are supermarkets, gated communities, things where people are living luxurious lives, but it's a tiny minority of people. But there are people who are saying, look, we're doing well, we're building the skyscrapers, we've got all this stuff going on, and that shows that we're developing. And this is what, as the pictures were showing, the economists and people saying things are getting better. They even say, well, life expectancy is going up, which it partly is after disastrous collapse in the with AIDS and so on in the 1990s. But that is going on in conjunction with the imperialist powers. And I think this is where Marxist politics comes in. They're saying it's not enough to talk about we need to renew the national state or get good people running the state. We need to say that this system isn't working at all, and that's why you need a class-based analysis. I was going to say something about the M-Pesa system in Kenya. I think that one of the things is this is the system of sending money about by mobile phones. It is something that's benefited a lot of ordinary people, but the reasons that banks are interested in it is because there's a lot of money being made in it, and it's a lot of traditional banks in the old banking system don't like the fact that it's outside their control. So I think this is about banks and control of banks rather than something that's in itself inherently liberatory.
Can I just say that late Chinese capitalism follows in the footsteps of early Western capitalism. And I like very much what you have said here. And we also got to realize that one of the unique things about the development of Chinese capitalism is that it has developed outside the umbrella of American imperialism. Therefore, you will find this demonization of what is happening and how China invests in Africa. I think you have been quite polite about Chinese capitalism and its investment in Africa itself, okay? I don't want to demonize it, but its explanation, its investment in Africa, we have to say, is not in favor of the, African masses, and it certainly isn't in favor of the Chinese. People talk about Chinese development, 500 million have been brought into urban, wealth, but that means there's still another 700 million who are in the countryside. What is very, really hopeful, actually, is listening to yourself, Chukwudinma. Because last night I was in a meeting, people talking about free trade and non-free trade, and what came out overridingly was a memory back to Maoism, right? I've forgotten all this, the statement that, Soviet communism was talking about peaceful coexistence, whereas Mao was talking about revolution, so on and so forth. And I thought that what's really good was listening to yourself and saying that what we need to look at is concentrating on the working class, understanding that, Africa is not a hopeless continent, it's an area of immense class struggle in Africa, so on and so forth. One question is this. Given all that, demonization, I was wondering how is Chinese migration into Africa received? Because I have some African friends, and one of him, he is Indian from South Africa, living here now, and he said that in 5 years, Zuma accepted 30,000 Chinese into Cape Town. I'll finish, yeah? Whereas in the past 50 years, the population of Chinese in South Africa was only 20,000. I'm not sure about the numbers, yeah? And he, he belonged to the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa. So he still felt, torn between that. Almost seeing that the Chinese there were, so my question is, are they migrants there? Do they intermarry? Do they settle? So on and so forth.
Yeah, I just wanted to buttress Ken Olende's position with two examples. It's also not just about that we are fighting, we have to fight against both, but that between them there's intricate interconnectedness. And this was what the Afrobeat maestro Fela Kuti captured without even being a Marxist in his song ITT, International Thief, that it is impossible for the thief outside to successfully steal inside without the thief inside. Just as the strength of the thief inside is weak without the strength behind him of the thief outside. So it's not just both, it is the intricate interconnectedness. And the thing about taking this position in practice in struggle was demonstrated by the Ogoni in their struggle. When they faced Shell and the Nigerian states, this led them even to a further stage of distilling out within themselves, within the Ogoni nationality, that even within the Ogoni nationality, there was that were now called vultures, the ruling, the elite that colluded with it. So it's important in my view to have that systemic approach to it. And I feel a bit bothered that what my brother I came in, I met speaking about that. We should sort out, there is people fighting against. This argument can be used against any oppressed people. Even women, you have you say women fight against themselves, so you right, and things like that. The fact of the matter is that you have it even within the ruling class, and the system of the ruling class, the fact that capitalism promotes competition is such that you could have that, but struggle helps to forge solidarity. And this is one of the practical things we saw in moving. We will never have 100% unity. There has never been 100% unity, and there won't be 100% unity. But struggle itself is what cements solidarity. Thank you.
Free books. Recommendation, please. Yeah, just recommendation, please. Yeah, to help, debate, I would like you to look at this book by Mahmoud Mamdani, When Victims Become Killers. Then this book again, Decade by Dambisa Moyo, of Chaos, still by Dambisa Moyo. They will help you a lot, okay? And to quickly add to what you just said, there's what they call the personification of the state in Africa today. That if you stand up to criticize the people in government who are driving down the state of the nation today, they look at you as a traitor. You are either exiled or killed or imprisoned. We have all of that everywhere in the world, no doubt. But the truth is, we need to change the narrative. Indians come here, they don't complain about the bitter past of colonization anymore. They focus on the now and try to do what they do to liberate themselves or empower themselves economically. The same thing with the Chinese. They were once colonized as well. The Americans as well. You understand me?
Very quickly. It's just, all what he has said, talking of Chinese, India, in every nation, Malcolm X made it clear to us, in every nation there are two nations. The nations of the rich and the nations of the poor. The nations of, so I think to start from a point of departure of nationalities, I think it's quite worrisome. If you look at it, the way capitalism manifests, the way because it is historically established. If you talk also of corruption, it's not as if you don't have corruption in other parts of the capitalist world, apart from, say, Africa. But what you call lobbying in the United States Congress, for example, will be with Ghana must go money. It's more raw because the way and manner of capitalism, of late capitalism's growth and development is more naked. You now have something of primitive accumulation in perpetuity, So, but all the books he has said, I'm very much aware of all this, and this don't even support that position, especially Mamdani. He's trying to talk more about citizenship, is that you have to go, he was looking at more beyond the earlier nationalities and nations before capitalism through colonialism gave what we have now. But essentially, and I think that is the most important element of this, imperialism and Africa today, you have to understand that what it means is that you have a capitalist class in Africa, and this is part and parcel of the global capitalist class. They benefit, and that is why, along with the 1% across the world, they can go anywhere, live anywhere, no matter what the state of the healthcare system, education system is for millions of Africans. They don't care, they don't have to care, because them and their children don't need this necessarily. They can go anywhere for treatment, like our president from Nigeria, who was there for 103 days last year. So, and the importance of this for us in struggle is that we, the working class people in Africa, have to unite not only within, against the enemy within, but with working class people across the world for us to fight and win a new world.
Hi. Found your discussion really interesting, so thank you so much for that. So I'm British Asian, and I saw the stuff that some of the people were saying I agree with, as well as agree with you. So with British Asian community, as well as the Asian, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, we have similar issues in terms of tribal conflict, as well as capitalism exploiting commodities. But I do wonder, from an African perspective, what do they think of the Asian perspective on the way we've moved on from British colonial history? Because I must agree that most British Asians, in my opinion, they don't hold the negative, even though there was many negatives about the British Empire. We acknowledge that there was some positives, like bringing in sanitization of clean water and farming in that perspective. So I do think it's interesting that, I do wonder, is there a link between the way a lot of British Asians now have excelled in academia or in law, families from a background of medics and lawyers, and I wonder is it simple to say that if we held on to the dark histories at times of British colonial history of India, would we want to be as progressive as we are? Because I don't know who said it, but absolutely I do agree that we've become we believe that Western education system has allowed many of us out of poverty, and we've utilised that. So I wonder what the African continent's perspective is on how the Southeast Asian countries have dealt with it, and is there any learnings or anything we can learn from each other? So.
Oh, yes.
Just one film, which is really beautiful. For those who don't know yet, We Come as Friends. It's very, very analytical, and it's about South Sudan. It's done by an Austrian filmmaker, and it shows the whole of society, and it's quite funny in some respects and quite disturbing. I mean, mostly disturbing. For instance, the president of South Sudan, he doesn't even know the words of his own national anthem. That's part of the film. I mean, it's just an example.
Okay, I've got time for one more question, I think. Yeah, red t-shirt, red shirt. Yeah.
I would just like Christopher as a poem was an idea to talk about the wealth of Gushing. I'd say that you can't ask whether the poor are getting poor by examining the wealth of the rich. You have to examine the wealth of the poor. So I'd like to ask, is the wealth gushing up, or is it trickling down, and the poor, whilst the rich are getting super rich, the poor are only getting slightly richer, or the poor getting poorer?
Does anyone else who hasn't spoken who would like to make a contribution, ask a question? No? Okay. Yeah, last.
But yeah, just very briefly, I just wanted to mention another book that was published earlier this year is Extracting Profit by Lee Wengrath. She's a comrade from the ISO US, and that talks a lot about how capitalism is exploiting Africa. And I think that's an important argument that we have with Walter Rodney. So Walter Rodney is arguing that it is Europeans that underdeveloped Africa. And I think we as Marxists would be saying that it's the international capitalist system, and of which Africans are also members of, that are exploiting Africans.
And I'm bringing back Chin to wrap up.
Thanks. Now, since everybody brought in their book reviews, I thought I might want to say a few words. Because Walter Rodney is not saying that Europeans underdeveloped Africa. He's talking about a system, and this system is capitalism. And he's talking about it at a time in the 1960s and 70s when Africa was just moving out of, trying to move out of colonialism. And he's not talking about Europeans as a people, but he's talking about the governments. But I do agree that Lee Wengrath's book is actually the reference that you should read today. And in terms of struggle, you should read Leo Zielig's new book on social movements in Africa, which are actually really, really good. Now, on the question on perspectives on Asia, I can't really answer that question. But my grandpa actually made an argument on the benefits of colonialism, where he said that colonialism was good, because it gave us access to Western education or access to train tracks. But the thing is that when you look at my grandfather's history, he actually just got lucky. He was a single child in his village. Out of his 30 brothers and sisters, he was the one who was handpicked to go get a scholarship and go study in Uganda, because the British colonials couldn't build enough schools in Tanzania. So it's a very subjective perspective. Or also, if you look about the train tracks that were built by the British or the Germans in Tanzania, they go straight to, or even by the Chinese, actually. There's one by the Chinese now that still works, that goes straight to the copper mines of Zambia, and then that goes back to the sea. So, it wasn't never intended for the benefits of Africans. And you could say that for a whole load of other developments. And yes, now, times from colonialism are different. Now, where you don't directly have the European powers who are ruling us, but Western powers today, and even the Chinese, rule us because they ally themselves in many ways with the African ruling class. And, activists, like, for instance, the Nigerian activist Ken Saro-Wiwa talks about the Slick Alliance, where multinationals like Chevron are allied basically with the Nigerian state. And so, for instance, Chevron, Condoleezza Rice, the ex-American Secretary of State, is on the board of directors of Chevron. And Chevron actually has airplanes that it lets the Nigerian government use to fly over and spray tear gas every time somebody is protesting. And so, basically, to say that it's not about Western interference anymore, I don't agree with that argument whatsoever, and it's clear, and there's examples of that on a day-to-day basis. Now, I thought there was an interesting question on the Chinese, because the Chinese who come to Africa, apparently there's about 1 million Chinese who come to Africa. And I think one thing that we have to know in terms of when we're building social movements on the continent, now I'm not an expert in that, but is that I think the Chinese who come to Africa are divided along class lines. You have the very rich owner of a multinational corporation, but you also have, your probably petty bourgeois Chinese person who would have his street market next to a Tanzanian or any African seller. Or also like in the case of Sudan, you had the ex-prisoners who came to work as workers. And maybe these are people who African social movements can actually win over. And we also have to remember that the working class, shouldn't have any nation whatsoever. And so if those Chinese workers who come have an interest against getting rid of Chinese imperialism and the Chinese government that didn't necessarily treat them, I think we should unite with them. And I wanted to finish off on talking about more international solidarity, because one thing that imperialism has created is havoc and misery and war on the African continent. And from that, you have a series of migrants who've come to settle and live in Europe or in America. And my grandparents, for instance, were the people from this generation. They left Nigeria in the 1960s after the war in Biafra. My grandmother came and worked for the NHS at some point. But my grandfather, for instance, he never bothered to get a British passport. And what you see is that immigration laws over the years, they just got tougher and tougher and tougher. And my grandpa was in a condition where basically the UK government forced him to go back 6 months to Nigeria and 6 months to the UK because he didn't have the right papers. A bit what's happening to the Windrush generation right now. It's exactly what's happening to the Windrush generation right now. And in Nigeria, my grandfather couldn't get the necessary medical attention that he needed, partly because Western imperialism destroyed the healthcare system, the public healthcare system for many people over there. And so in many ways, and my grandpa has it good because he still has a family. We can give him help and anything like that. But if you look at what the European governments have been doing more recently, sending back African migrants, black African migrants to Libya, for instance, where basically there's slave camps for black Africans. And those slave camps are a direct result of imperialism, where NATO, European powers, and American powers basically threw bombs on Libya and created havoc and chaos in the region. And that's why the slave camps in Libya today and they're flourishing. And these governments are hypocritical, They would cry over the slave camps, but would be happy to make life hell for migrants in this country and send them back to those slave camps, which is absolutely terrible. And that's why I'm proud to be part of a movement that on the one hand says stop the war, but on the other hand says open the borders, let the refugees in, And my organization, that I belong to, doesn't just talk about doing those things. We're out on every Stop the War protest. We're out on every anti-racist protest. And we work with groups like Stop the War and Stop to Racism. And, our argument for opening the borders is that we believe, basically, that when people from different languages, different races, different cultures, live, eat, and work together, they develop bonds of friendship and solidarity, which gives them the confidence to unite and fight and destroy imperialism once and for all. That's all.